Books with people in them are a lot more interesting than books without people. So how do you quote someone in a book?
We're Roger and Carolyn Nielsen. We've been writing for a long time, and our desire now is to share our knowledge with business people who want to write a book for their business and for their life and to share their experience. In this video, we're going to show you how to quote someone in a book.
Quotes substantiate the claims that you make. You can use them to support general information, so it can go either way, either make the statement of general information and then the quote, or you can do the quote and then the general information.
Quotes also shed light on the characteristics and mannerisms of your sources, the people that you are identifying.
Quotes give authority to your book. They tell the reader that this is not just something you're making up on the fly, that other people also believe the point that you're trying to make.
You can also use quotes to introduce the major players in your book. That's the easiest way to introduce them.
You can use quotes to open or to conclude a chapter. In our videos on chapters, we'll go into more detail, but just remember that you can use a quote at the beginning or at the end of a chapter.
You can also use quotes to structure the story detail that you are trying to get across. You tell a story, but before you tell that story, you introduce them with a quote.
You can also use a quote to explain or set up an anecdote. You use the quote and then tell the story, and that's a very effective way to introduce an anecdote. Where do you get quotes? And actually, they're all over the place. You can get them through interviews. You can get quotes from books. You can quote podcasts and people who do blogs. But whenever you're quoting someone, there's a procedure you have to follow.
There are two types of quotes. There's the direct quote and the indirect quote. The quote is where you take someone's actual words and run them, just copy them verbatim. An indirect quote is when you find a quote that maybe they don't want you to use that quote, so you write around it. You figure out how to say the same thing in your own words.
Possibly the quote reveals more information than they're comfortable revealing, maybe a name or some detail that would be embarrassing to someone. So you just write around it.
You write around it.
Put it in your own words.
You don't always have to get permission to use a quote. If it's a verbatim quote, then yes. Of course, an indirect one, you don't need the permission. But to get permission to use a quote, what I usually do is that I will take that quote, usually it's probably from an interview that I've done. I'll take that quote, I'll show the paragraph before and the paragraph after, and I will send it to my source and say, please look at that. I'm not asking for approval on it. Oh, you don't need approval.
Opens a can of worms.
What you are asking for is this correct? Is this accurate? And then I give them a deadline and say, please return this back to me by this certain date. But just see, I want you to know what it's about. Just validate it. Certify that it's correct.
Back to setting a time to respond by. If they don't respond by that time, you tell them, I'm going to run it as it is.
Yes. But one thing you really have to identify who that person is that you are quoting. If you don't identify, that quote is known as a blind quote. And they're not as strong, they're not as effective. You can run blind quotes. The easiest way is to run an identified quote, a blind quote, an identified quote. People assume that, they kind of mesh them together so that they're quoting.
So that way they don't feel uncomfortable that you don't have a name on that quote because they really don't notice.
They don't notice that the one is blind. You do need to identify.
The reason is that it gives the quote strength. Yeah. Right. That this is not just something you've made up. In fact, that's one of the things we'll talk about later. You don't make up quotes.
Don't make up quotes.
Because you'll get found out and people will
Yeah.
call you on it and your integrity will be lost. So it's important to substantiate who said it, and then if it's a verbatim quote, get their
Yes, and then to add more strength to the source is location.
Yeah.
John Smith of Fairview, Ohio says this. That's a real strong quote. It is important to acknowledge your sources, to stay in contact with them. We'll talk more about this in another video on interviewing, but treat them well because they have helped you. And if you can maintain contact with them, you may be able to quote them later in another book that you want to write. If you like this content, make sure you watch our video on how to come up with a book idea.